All right, good evening, everyone. I believe that we are live. Good evening and welcome to this Maclean's live discussion. Thank you for joining us. My name is Desmond Cole. I am a journalist, an activist, and I'm the author of The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. Paul Wells has been running most of these Maclean's live discussions, but I actually got a call from him asking me if I would like to host this evening's particular discussion. And I understand that Paul was urged to do this by his fellow Maclean's colleague, Andre Demise. So I would like to say thank you to Paul and to Andre for giving me this opportunity this evening to have what I anticipate to be a really rich and fulsome discussion with four Black thinkers, activists, scholars, and actors for our Black lives right now. Thanks also to Irene Giannone for making the technical faculties possible for this evening's chat. Let me introduce you to our four guests. Actually, before I do that, I will say that the Canadian Bankers Association has made this ongoing weekly series of talks possible, and we thank them for that. And now I will introduce the four panelists for this evening's discussion. Essie Adujan is the author of the Giller Prize-winning novels Half-Blood Blues and Washington Black. Cyrus Marcus Ware is a Vanier scholar doing a PhD at York University, a visual artist, community activist, researcher, youth advocate, and educator. Ian Williams is a poet and novelist, professor of creative writing at the University of British Columbia, and the author of the Giller Prize-winning novel, Reproduction. And Robin Maynard is a Vanier scholar, a PhD student at the University of Toronto, an award-winning author of Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. Welcome to all of you. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Essie, I'd like to start off this evening's discussion. You and several others, myself included actually, wrote essays in a Maclean's series, Letters to America, that was addressing the recent upheaval in the United States and across the world for Black life, and the task of confronting racism that we Canadians know is ever too present in our society. In your letter, Essie, The Weight of Change Should Not Rest on the Shoulders of Black People, you talk about the pattern of outrage and forgetting that you've observed among white people on this continent, a pattern that you point out changes nothing in the long run. So to begin this evening's discussion, Essie, can you speak a little bit more about this pattern of outrage and forgetting that we have been witnessing in response to anti-Black violence?
Well, I mean, we've been watching videos for years now that people have been taking on their cell phones of brutality meted out on Black people by police. And it seems like, you know, with the ones that are sort of most visible in the media, we have the outrage. And then there's the activism. And then there seems to be afterwards, kind of I guess a kind of forgetting, like a sort of collective suppression that this is something that is happening, and then we move on until we get yet another video that we're all watching. In fact, when I first saw the video of George Floyd a few weeks ago, that had been sent to me by somebody, I immediately when I was watching it thought, did this happen recently, or is this something that I had missed from a previous, how old is this video? And I think that really speaks to the fact that this has been a really strong pattern, generally speaking, that we watch these, we get outraged, we move on until there's another incident. And one of the things that has been, I think, so heartening watching the demonstrations of the last weeks is that, first of all, speaking to somebody who kind of had been through the civil rights movement in the United States as a child and had seen their parents be activists, and they were saying that, you know, they were also really struck by the fact that today the crowds are so diverse in terms of who's out there, you know, speaking out against police violence, against anti-Black racism, and that this is a huge shift. And the fact that these are continuing to go on week after week, that, you know, really people are not going to let go of this until there have been real systemic changes. This has been enormous.
Yes, definitely. Ian, let me go to you next, because Essie brings up videos, and you know, you wrote a letter for Maclean's as well, and your letter was to cell phone companies, and it was entitled, "The Cameras on Your Phone Make Black People Invisible." In this letter, Ian, you talk about the endless demand from the white mainstream society for evidence of police brutality. And I want to know, how do we deal with this demand for evidence when we as Black people know that the issue of police brutality is not really an issue of evidence? And do we engage with that suggestion and that argument at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the issue here is not evidence, right? There's an overwhelming amount of evidence about sort of the cruelty enacted on Black bodies and just outright murders. What seems to be sort of parallel to this is the fact that in the light of all of this evidence, that the word or interpretation of a white body overwhelms what our senses can perceive. So it just goes to show, I think, the power and the far reach of an institution desperate to protect itself. So I'm speaking of whiteness as an institution, whatever form it takes in commerce or in publishing or in policing or whatever, that even in the light of sensory and indisputable evidence, a white officer can offer an interpretation that will make us question the very things that we see. So it's not just a political issue out there. I think on a day-to-day level, how this manifests itself is that who are we inclined to believe? If you are presented, if you're a school teacher and a white student comes to you and a Black student comes to you with different interpretations of an event on a playground, who are you inclined to believe? And the flip side of that is, as a Black body, what do we feel compelled to prove, right? We're often doing these kinds of gymnastic routines to prove our intelligence or to prove the validity of our interior and emotional lives. And at what point will there be a kind of equality of the people that we believe and the unnecessariness of us to prove the fact that we are simply human?
Cyrus, I'd like to go to you next. Many people want to believe that things have changed in the last few weeks based on what we've been seeing. We've been seeing things like the release of some prisoners from jails in Canada. We've been seeing the growing calls for police abolition, which I think are louder in the mainstream than I can ever remember. And people feel like this might signal a hopeful shift. Cyrus, how do you feel, having done this work for so long, about this current public discourse, and in some cases, the public policy shifts that we're seeing happen in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an exciting time, I think, for, you know, as someone who's been an abolitionist for 25 years, like, never would I have thought that it would be so taken up in the mainstream. We got to be careful of that and make sure that it doesn't get co-opted. But, you know, this moment, I think what we're seeing right now is this sort of rapid, you know, sort of revolution in people's consciousness, where they're recognizing that, hey, wait a minute, what exactly are the police doing right? What are they getting right? You know, they're not particularly resolving, you know, crisis or conflict in a good way. You know, those are often resulting in fatalities. You know, they're not particularly good at solving crimes and actually reducing crime rates on our streets. They're not, you know, resolving in our communities. They're not supporting people who are in psychiatric distress. So people are starting to be like, wait a minute, like, what are we putting all of this money into? And then you can start to think, okay, well, what would we rather imagine? And that's where the abolitionist dreaming comes in. We start to imagine the possibilities that, you know, we could have these communities that are actually rooted in actual safety and security, social justice, and things like that. So that's, you know, I think it's really interesting to see this. And I think because of COVID, we saw this rapid decarceration, you know, movement spread across the globe, where places all over the world, people were being let out of prison. And I think for a lot of us who had been saying for 20 years, you know, it's as simple as opening the doors, it showed that here in Canada, it literally was. I mean, they opened the doors and they let people out back to their communities, you know, back to their families, you know, back to their homes. And we can continue to do that, you know, making sure that we have supports in place for people when they're getting out, of course, but that, you know, it is actually as simple as that. We could build something different. We could build something better. And I think that that's what people are starting to want to dream. People want to imagine something different. The current system is not working for us. It's brutalizing us. And so we need something better. And I think that's the revolution in consciousness that's happening right now.
Thank you. And I want to get back to that idea a little later about COVID and about how the COVID pandemic has kind of combined with this crisis for Black life and what's being made of that and what's happening. Robin, let me come to you. In the advocacy to abolish policing that we're witnessing right now, Black people assert that policing is a relationship of dominance rather than a relationship of care, safety, and protection. You've written, Robin, about this relationship of dominance between Black people and the Canadian government, and how that relationship of dominance extends well beyond policing. Can you talk a little bit about this, please?
Absolutely. So I think that what we're witnessing right now is something that Black communities have really been putting to the forefront for centuries, which is that, or for generations rather, which is that policing itself is a kind of racial violence, is a kind of harm towards our communities, whether that's in response to mental health crises, where we see Black people like Deontay Campbell being killed in the context of a mental health crisis, or whether that's in response to the policing of drugs, which we know are just leading to, you know, massive deaths and overdose, of people being, you know, incarcerated for something that is absolutely not an issue of policing of law and order, right? So we see the senseless destruction that policing in particular has enacted on Black people, and we're seeing a really strong push to question whether or not the police in fact bring us safety, and really an urge as young Black people are pushing across the country, across North America, to say that in fact police are not making us safe, that we can dream of safety otherwise. But I think that what we're also witnessing, the fact that we're seeing these large you know, revolts, uprisings, organizing moments all across North America and around the world right now, shows us that of course it's about policing, that policing of Black people in particular has been violence, you know, for its entire history. But also, if we look to who has access to a decent life, particularly in the context of a pandemic in Canada, we see that it's, you know, Black and Latinx agricultural workers who are at the forefront of exposure to the pandemic, who are being exposed and who are becoming ill, gravely ill at vastly disproportionate rates. That it's, you know, Haitian undocumented women as personal care workers at the forefront, again, of the care of the pandemic. We see, you know, who may face deportation, right, after exposing themselves to this virus to protect, you know, what white people in this society. We see the, you know, the ways that racism has been embedded into not only, of course, policing, but in terms of, you know, incarceration, in terms of immigration detention. We've had Black migrants undertake an 8-day hunger strike because they were being exposed again to COVID-19 under lack of protection. So what we see is that, you know, of course, that policing can be documented in the system of law enforcement, but that has also always been part of child welfare, of our education system, of our immigration system, and that this institutional kinds of anti-Black racism is something that we're still very much reckoning with today. And when people are out demanding an end to racial injustice, that demand goes well beyond any small scale, you know, any small scale way that we could address that within policing. It's really about who has access, as I said, to a decent life and who does not.
Thank you, Robin. Ian, I'll go to you for this next thing, because this time that we've been experiencing in the last 3 weeks, I've just seen so many Black folks on yourself. I've seen some of the people on this panel on television. I've seen all of you in print. And there's just this nearly unprecedented visibility of Black writers and thinkers and actors in this moment. But I suspect it's not going to last. While it does, there's so much put upon us to respond, to be visible, to speak, to explain, to teach. And Ian, I'll go to you on this first, and then anyone else can jump in. How does it strike you to see this very jarring for me shift where Black people can be invisible from Canadian media one day and then so visible for weeks at a time before we fear, I think, disappearing again?
Right. Well, it shows you that that invisibility is really a trick of mind, right? That people know we are out there, and we are out there invisibly until we are necessary, until we are called to speak upon on a particular subject. And when we're no longer necessary, we can go back into invisibility. It's just actually an example of how the system works. What that does, though, is that is in fact really exhausting on the Black person, both sort of physically to sort of get things done, but emotionally really, really taxing to have your existence kind of flicker in and out of public consciousness at the whims of some kind of larger universal or psychic demand. Yeah, so I find it very difficult, this kind of moment. And, you know, everybody on this panel has a different personality and a different temperament, and we respond to these, the news differently. And there's only so much of it that I can process before my voice starts to waver like this. And I feel myself, every time like these kinds of moments occur, barely able to sort of contain myself, you know? The emotion is just right below the surface and the body betrays it all the time. I can speak about anything quite calmly and quite reasonably, but then you feel something so large like welling up in you and trying to sort of present it in a really kind of, I mean, this forum, when do we see Black folks gather to talk about other things, right? I would love to talk to Essie and to Robin and to Cyrus and to you about other things. But it's this emotionally charged thing that brings us visibility, and it's costing us in our health and in other ways. I'd be curious to hear what other folks are thinking about this. Has it told been on you?
Yeah, I just was thinking about, you know, there's this beautiful book called Mounting Frustrations, the Art Museum in the Age of Black Power that Susan Cahan wrote. And it looks at how I'm an artist, and, you know, it's only in these moments of extreme racial tension and racial violence in the streets, in these moments of upswings of protest, that they condescend to engage with us, to engage with our art practice, to engage with us in these moments, right? And I think that that's what we're seeing now, right? It's only in these moments, right? So this has been sort of a documented practice, and I think that, you know, yeah, I'm very curious to see how we kind of push back against that modality. Yeah.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
Sure. No, I have a writer friend who I was just looking at her Facebook the other day, and she had written that she's not going to be doing any panels and she's not going to write any articles because she feels like that to do that is to do the work that others should be doing for themselves. And I know that just speaking to, for instance, my sister who works in, you know, a certain industry, and you know, she's, you know, I guess works in, she's always worked in finance or some kind of a corporate sort of space. And she has people who have been reaching out to her constantly, white people, you know, just to check in with her and to ask about her experiences. And somebody reached out and said, you know, I've been watching When They See Us, you know, on Netflix to try and sort of, and I think she was a little bit taken aback by that, just because, I mean, it's great that people are wanting to engage with this and learn about anti-Black racism and really try and understand it. But I think also she feels a little bit like there's some tokenism involved, and that, once this moment she feels has passed, that these people are not going to be reaching out to her anymore. This is not something that she feels will be, a kind of permanent interest. But who can say? I mean, it's a start. It's good that people are wanting to engage now, and hopefully this is something that people will carry forward. But who knows?
Robin, let me ask you, because you've done a lot of media in the last couple of weeks as well, and I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure that part of your reasons for doing that is to engage in a sort of public education. But what do you think about what Essie has just said here, and this responsibility to teach others, essentially, that is constantly being thrust upon us?
Well, I mean, I can answer this in so many different ways. I think that in one way, particularly the way that the media's systematic erasure of Black peoples almost all of the time, unless there's a protest in the United States, is something that is just insulting, to be called onto panels to continuously have to just ask, is there racism, for example, given the ongoing, evidence, as you pointed out, Ian, to the contrary. These kinds of requests, this constant demand for proof, the interrogation that we are forced to undergo, I find exhausting. And sometimes I take up because I believe that even regardless that public education is in itself a little bit helpful, I think it's not the only way to engage. But I think it's something that can be helpful, particularly in times like this. But what I do see right now, and where I'm getting energy from, and why I'm finding this actually really invigorating at this time, is because I'm less interested in sort of where the mainstream public's attention is and what I'm seeing across the country. And I just had an incredible Zoom with Black organizers from all around Canada today, is that, young Black people are incredibly passionate, incredibly courageously fighting this incredible struggle for all of us right now, risking their lives in the context of COVID-19 to be out in the streets to demand something new. So it's not only about naming and explaining racism over and over again. I think that particularly what's happening right now is more than just people who are out saying racism exists, but it's people demanding things that are quite radical that we would not really have heard entering the mainstream, talking about things like defunding the police, like pushing police out of schools, a fundamental transformation in how we actually govern our society. So that's something that, although there is this exhausting demand in one side, I'm also just seeing this incredible energy and incredible curiosity by people who sometimes for the first time, 18-year-olds suddenly for the first time organizing demonstrations, wanting to learn about the history of slavery, segregation in Canada, and deciding to move into action. So that's why particularly I find now a time where I've chosen to engage my energy in media, where I often don't necessarily give so much of myself to that. But I do think that we're witnessing a very particularly important time right now. That's kind of a reckoning that stands, I think, to make a larger interruption than perhaps we've seen in the past with the status quo.
Thank you, Robin. Cyrus, we know that Black people are overrepresented in our prisons, overrepresented in our jails, overrepresented in immigration detention within Canada. But jails and prisons and immigration detention centers are some of the most hidden places in our society here in Canada. How do we make the struggle? How do you and others make the struggle of Black people inside these walls, behind these cages, where the government doesn't want us to see what's going on? How do you make that more visible?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just to say, there is this practice of disappearing people through putting them into prison camps, into prisons. People are removed from their communities, they're removed from their families, they're removed from their support networks. This is a strategy of the state, right? This is like part of what is intended to happen. For every story that we see on the news of a Black person who's killed by a police interaction that goes wrong, there is countless others where there isn't a fatality in that moment, but the person is still taken away from their communities. They're incarcerated, they're kept from their communities, so they're still being removed. They may not have died, but they're being sent away, sometimes for life, for things that other people would get a charge of maybe 18 months, So there's a hugely disproportionate sentencing practice that makes sure that Black people stay in prison for longer, have longer sentencing, have higher security ratings. So anyways, what we need to do is we need to demand that, first of all, prisons are part of our communities. Prisoners are part of our communities. They will be back in our communities one day, and we need to fight to make sure that we have, the things that prisoners need to be able to survive the violent situation that they're in, while we're working to try to tear down the walls and bring everybody home. I think that one of the things that happened when they moved everyone from the Don Jail to South Detention Center was, again, you're just removing the opportunity for us to come face to face in contact with a prison. Now it's so much further away for people to do organizing and activism. And that's the strategy, right? But we continue to fight, and we continue to say, prisoners' rights for all and free them all. And I just wanted to mention, you mentioned quite a few of different carceral spaces, but unfortunately, Black people are also overrepresented within psychiatric detention. So that's another area where there's more work to be done to say, stop disappearing our people, stop removing them away from all of the supports that they need in order to heal, in order to have a trauma-informed approach to any of the things that are happening in the world.
I really appreciate that comment, Cyrus, because it has really struck me again these last few weeks that death seems to be the baseline for paying attention to Black suffering, when the variation and spectrum of challenges and oppression that we are facing on a daily basis is so broad. And it's such a mistake and a dishonor to only focus on death or the most severe consequences of the carceral state and of white supremacy. Ian and Essie, you both as artists, I want maybe you to reflect on this idea too, of making visible things about our Black life and our Black existence that people don't see or don't pay attention to in their day-to-day lives, because I do believe that that is always one of the things that great art does. Would either of you like to comment on that?
You want to go first, Essie?
Sure. I think my approach with my work has always been to tell stories from the African diaspora that maybe we haven't heard. Locating Black people within histories that you wouldn't expect maybe to find them in. With Half-Blood Blues, writing about Afro-Germans who'd been born after the First World War. And what they endured, and also that migration of African-American artists over to Europe because they faced such discrimination in the United States that they were prohibited from playing, and so they went over to Europe and found great appreciation. Whether some of that was tokenism, obviously, but they were deeply appreciated by French and German audiences. And then, of course, with Washington Black, discovering this boy and locating him within, I guess, seeing him become a fully formed man who is in a lot of ways governed by Enlightenment principles in the end, and giving him. Delivering access to his psyche, which trying to show every aspect of his life, his sexual life, his hopes, his dreams, his traumas, and really forcing a reader to come right up against all of these different aspects of his psyche. This for me is really important to show these fully rounded Black characters that readers might, readers of other races might read these books and kind of begin to understand the ways that their lives, have been privileged and differ so hugely from his, and what he's lost by being born in his time as a Black man, but also to see that maybe some of their hopes and dreams for their own lives are very similar. And we speak so much about empathy these days, and it becomes overused and hackneyed, but I really think that there's something there in terms of what art can do to bridge these distances between people.
Yeah, I mean, following exactly where Essie left off there, like what can art do in a moment like this? And I think it sort of offers us a counter narrative to the evidence that we have. So for me, in relation to evidence, we've got the imagination. And I think seeing the products of the Black imagination and seeing also the interiority of Black lives, not as bodies destroyed on video, but as women cutting tomatoes in their kitchen that we can render in novels. In reproduction, in my novel, there's a white father and a Black mother who have a biracial child. And really that is the collision of white patriarchy and Black feminism. And what are the products, what possible life could this kid have on a theoretical level? But on how does a life unfold when you've got these enormous forces trying to stare you in very narrow paths? So art as a corrective, I think, to the kind of bludgeoning effect of media and of evidence and of destruction. We have this space where the readers themselves complicit in the formation of something new. What Cyrus said about imagining a world that is a police state or an alternative to the police force. When a reader cooperates or a citizen cooperates with the imagination of a possible world, I think art helps us get to that place of exercising our imagination.
Thanks for that. Robin, let me come back to you. The COVID-19 pandemic began to change the way that all of us live, and even the way that we're having this discussion this evening around mid-March. And, you know, that COVID pandemic, as has been mentioned already in this discussion, has put a lot of non-citizen Haitian asylum seekers, for example, in the province of Quebec, in grave danger as they work in the long-term care homes in that part of the country. We know that PSWs and nurses across Ontario and Quebec are disproportionately Black, also another racialized people. We know how dangerous this pandemic is with all of the other things going on for Black life and Black survival. But people around us keep talking about this idea of a new normal or getting back to normal. And I just want your reaction, Robin, to this idea that we can or should return to a normal after this pandemic subsides.
Thank you for that question. I think that you're pointing out something, you know, first of all, really the disproportionate vulnerability to death that Black people, that Black migrants, that Black women, that really across the board, even who's deemed essential workers in terms of food delivery, you know, that we're seeing an uneven distribution of risk, in the words of Christina Sharp, and a vulnerability to death. So I think that, and that's been made so clear, and that's been really brought into view with the way that the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed the functioning of our society. So I think it becomes clear that I think that there's a very strong reason that we're seeing the kinds of protests that we're seeing right now that is precisely not about a return to normal. Because under normal, of course, we know that Black people were already being disproportionately killed, vastly disproportionately killed at the hands of the police, vastly incarcerated, again, held in detention center, being pushed out of school vis-a-vis the school to prison pipeline, you know, in conditions of poor health, living in food deserts, you know, far more substantially than other populations in our society, along with Indigenous peoples as well. We know that it was, what is being exposed is that the world was already fundamentally grounded in forms of racial and economic injustice that were being protected by policing and by prisons that were holding in place a status quo that to so many of us was violent. So I think that what we're seeing now is absolutely not just a desire to go back to a normal that for many of us was already you know, highly dangerous, that even before the risks of death that we now see with the COVID-19 pandemic, that it, you know, migrant workers who are disproportionately Black, again, largely from the Caribbean, as well as from Mexico. You know, last year there was a report that was demonstrating how already their housing conditions were vastly unsafe, that people who were reporting unsafe conditions were facing deportation. We had, you know, the death of Andrew Goku, of Abdirahman Abdi. These were all, you know, police killings that that happened before this pandemic. So what we're seeing is not only a response to a crisis of the present moment, but it's to a historical crisis of racially, the embeddedness of racial and economic violence that has really been part of the founding of this society. We're seeing a reckoning with the legacy of slavery, with the legacy of colonialism that has not yet been meaningfully addressed. So I think what we're really witnessing is a strong urgency, particularly with young people, to change towards something new, that we don't want to go back to SWAT team raids of Somali grandparents over the criminalization of drugs, for example, that we actually want to see kinds of safety that genuinely keep people safe, that we could actually look at, even if you think about the Toronto police budget and think about how that $1 billion could be spent actually addressing housing people who we've always been told there wasn't enough money to house, right? But we realize that there's always been a particular choice to allocate funds towards policing people as opposed to keeping them safe, as opposed to housing people, as opposed to harm reduction services, as opposed to community programming. So I think that what we're witnessing is, I believe, a refusal to look back and to accept that status quo any longer. And I think we're seeing an increasing questioning of how did we ever let it, how was it ever let to go so badly, that people have been protesting. This is not the first time we've seen protests, right? We are seeing echoes of protests that happened a few years ago, that happened in the 1990s, that happened in the 1960s, since people working to end slavery and anti-colonial struggle, that this is a long-standing struggle, and one where I believe we're seeing another, you only ever see the tip of the dissatisfaction at these moments of protests. And I think that what we're seeing is really just a small fraction of that level of how much people would really like to see a fundamental transformation of this time.
Cyrus, would you like to pick up on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just, I think fundamentally this is a moment of profound change. I mean, in the sort of panarchy cycle of systems, sort of the way that systems sort of cycle and flow through periods of extreme growth and then periods of collapse, and then the possibility of planting new seeds for something new to grow. And it's just a cycle that happens in systems. And we're witnessing the end of a structure. We were already witnessing that before COVID. And then after COVID, the economic realities of COVID, they were putting $1 trillion a day into the stock market, trying to prop up capitalism, this raced form of capitalism that has proved to be so violent for so many of us. They were doing all of these things to try to prop up the system that was already in a state of collapse. So then when you add in the police violence and the fact that, as Robin said, there's already this groundswell of activism that's been happening on this continent for at least 100 years, working towards abolition, and now you're seeing this bubbling up at this moment, at a moment where there already was a period of systems collapse. I mean, these are revolutionary opportunities. This is an opportunity for a revolutionary change. And I think that what Robin is saying is absolutely true. People are not satisfied with the status quo. And I think that, the power of the people, is so strong, and it's really visible in these moments when we see things like some of the inspirational things we saw in the States where, buildings that don't normally burn were burning, and objects that don't normally burn were burning, and cities were literally on fire with the sparks of change. And I think that is, we're riding this wave right now, and this is a revolutionary wave that is taking us somewhere, and where it goes, we get to decide. We're literally dropping the seeds as we go that is planting the new world that we're going to live in. And I'm so excited for it. And there's so much possibility.
You really anticipated what I wanted to go to next, Cyrus, because I've been thinking about the words and thoughts of people, Black people, that have been inspiring me and giving me strength in this moment and helping me to dream. James Baldwin ended his address so many years ago in that very famous debate that he did in England against, what's that jackass's name? Doesn't matter, does it? But he said, Buckley, William F. Buckley, that's who I'm thinking of. But at the end of that speech in his debate, James Baldwin said, "Until this moment, there's scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it by their very presence will wreck it." And if that happens, it is a very grave moment for the West. So I think James Baldwin could have anticipated, Cyrus, these cars on fire, these buildings on fire, and people lighting a fire in their hearts to try and make change. Essie, can I ask you, and I'll give all of you a chance if you want to reflect on this, what are the words or the thoughts or the people that you're finding yourself going back to as you watch what's happening in this world right now?
You know, Desmond, I recently finished reading your book, actually, and I got just so much out of it. These stories of policing that, don't get sort of widely reported. The story of the gallery owner who had been sort of harassed by police for months and months until it ended in this, with him being tasered on the floor of his own gallery, in front of friends who had gathered for an opening. I thought this is something that, I was quite shocked not to have heard that story. Or the story, I was very, very struck by the story of the 6-year-old girl who the school had called the police on her because she was behaving in a quote, violent fashion. And, the fact that she had been handcuffed and that, it's just these kinds of very eye-opening stories that make you realize that the system is truly, truly broken. And that is, it's really, I've been thinking a lot about how do we sort of institute, change that's lasting. And I really feel like, having read that story and just thinking my way through things, that really this is something that has to start happening at the school age level, in grade schools, that we need to be educating all students about Black histories, and not just the history of the Underground Railroad, but the history of slavery in this country, the history of, I'm from Alberta, as I know you are, but the history of, the Last Best West campaign, where the Canadian government invited people from from the United States to come up and populate the land. And, when they received 1,000 freed slaves from Oklahoma, this was too much. There was a huge campaign to stop that kind of immigration, because that was not at all who they wanted homesteading the land. There's also, I live in British Columbia. We have deep roots in British Columbia. In the Gulf Islands, there was, a substantial population of Black people on Salt Spring Island, for instance. And this isn't something that is necessarily widely known. I mean, you tell people about this and they're quite shocked. So, I've really been thinking about schooling and really reaching children at these younger ages, so that they have this more expansive idea of what it means to be a Canadian, and what Canadian histories encompass. And I think this is because I have children who are in an elementary school, and these are things that I'd like for them to be learning. So certainly, your book is one of the things that really had me thinking about this. So thank you for writing that.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. Ian, where are you drawing your reflections or sources of inspiration or thought from as you watch what's happening?
Well, yesterday I was standing in line for an hour, COVID fallout, and I was reading, it's right here next to me, Between the World and Me, again. I flipped through my Baldwin recently. Fire Next Time, I've got just, and you kind of dip in and you dip out, and there's something really comforting and prophetic about seeing Baldwin's prophecies sort of come to fruition, the kind of otherworldly sort of working out of his logic. So I find him a good source of just, what to put it, he's not always optimistic, but the sort of clear-eyed realities that he envisioned from a time before all of this evidence again. when there was already too much evidence back then. And now we see it just kind of unfolding. Yeah.
How about yourself, Robin?
It's so funny that you should ask that, because I didn't know this, you were going to ask this question, and I feel that I have on my table like the ways. I always read many books at the same time, so I'll just explain to you which ones and why, actually, because this is exactly how I've been trying to ground myself in this moment. I have a very well-worn Octavia Butler, Seed to Harvest. Her work is something that just deeply grounds me in the radical world building possibilities and creativity and dreaming of thousands of worlds otherwise. I'm reading C.L.R. James's A History of Pan-African Revolt, because it reminds, I think it's always essential to ground ourselves in the globality of Black struggle and the ways that this has been, an enduring kind of revolt that has been, again, like he's talking about the Haitian Revolution, tying that into the anti-colonial struggles. And to me, to always think about struggle as something that emerges from a long history. Here then, I'm reading Leanne Simpson's As We Have Always Done. It's something that is both just beautifully, beautifully crafted, and in a time when I think we're really called to think with Indigenous solidarity, as we continue to see ongoing land dispossession and Indigenous peoples being killed at the hands of the police at enormous rates in this moment as well. Leanne's work is something that's just so powerful and really brings to life what resistance is and what it means. And then I found this excellent, it's called Canada and Us Now, the first anthology of Black poetry and prose in Canada, which has the works of Dion Brand, of Austin Clarke, of Charles Roach from the 1970s. And it's just, you turn back to poems written, what seems to me, from before I was born, really speaking to so many of the kinds of crises that we're facing today. I just find that so incredibly grounding again. That historical, I guess, connection that we can really bring always our present into. I think it keeps us from a kind of hopelessness and kind of, instead of being stuck in that moment to moment, like as if we're always just facing something new. So all of these together kind of help just keep me grounded in different ways. Grounded, furious, excited together, right? So.
You came prepared for that question. And Cyrus, finally yourself.
Yeah, I mean, well, Walid Imarisha says that all speculative fiction, all activism is speculative fiction because we're daring to imagine that another world is possible. So I too have been really drawing on the speculative fiction. But for me, what I've been holding on to, the thing that I wake up and think about is this Toni Cade Bambara quote as an artist. When she said that the role of the artist from the oppressed community was to make revolution irresistible. And I've been very interested in that, as like, how am I helping to make revolution irresistible in all of my artistic practice and all of my work? How do you, make that spark, possible? So I've been really drawn to that. Cara Springer's beautiful work, A Small Matter of Engineering, that she installed in front of the design school in the States with the black freestanding billboard that just said, white people do something. I mean, I've been thinking about that so much and about that call to action, that it isn't just Black folks who should be responsible in ensuring that Black Lives Matter, and that there is this broader call, to just do something, get involved. Now is the time more than ever to do that. And then thinking of Asada Shakur, and the words that she wrote in that poem for that song she collaborated with Asian Dub Foundation, where she says, that she is a struggler. She's a reluctant, and a warrior. She's a reluctant warrior and a reluctant struggler, but she does it because she's committed to life. And she says that she wishes that she was free to be so much more: a sculptor, a gardener, a painter, but that the only way to live on this planet at this moment with any human dignity is to struggle. And so that's what she does. And I've been holding on to that because that is what I think we're doing. That's why, it's hard. We're not sleeping. We're working around 24/7, literally fighting for our lives, but we're doing it because because we're committed to life, as she says.
I just want to remind our viewers that joining me this evening are 4 best-selling and award-winning writers. And in addition to the works that they're encouraging you to think about and explore this evening, they all have works that are out here that you need to support and buy and share with your friends and family, share in your book club group. That's part of why it is such an honor for me to be part of this evening. I want to share another quote from Bell Hooks's book, Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope, where she says, in a culture of domination, almost everyone engages in behaviors that contradict their beliefs and values. And I've just not been able to stop thinking about that quote as I see this struggle to bring people's actions in line with their purported values in this country and try to create systems of police response and other structural systems that actually support and love and care for Black people. But we are coming up on the end of our time. And before this broadcast is over, I would like to make sure that we say the names, among others, of Chantal Moore, Rodney Levy, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, DeAndre Campbell, Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, Jamal Francis, and names of people that we don't know whose lives have recently been taken from us in this country by police. All of the names that I just read are the names of Black and Indigenous people who should still be with us, except for police violence across Canada. So to end this evening, I would like to ask each of you, how do we honor the memories and the lives of Black, Indigenous, other racialized people, queer and trans people, people living with disabilities, people who don't have enough to eat, who are really the people that this struggle, for me anyway, that's what this is about. It's about unseating the comfortable and shining the light for those who don't have privilege, protection, safety right now. How do we honor the lives of those who we mourn and who we're out in the streets fighting for? And I guess I'll go back to Essie for this and go work our way back down.
We refuse to let them be forgotten. We keep discussing them. We keep going into the streets and not allowing their legacies to be forgotten. We write about them. This is something where you refuse to let forgetting prevail. You refuse to let it truly extinguish these people. You know, it's so important to keep the discussion alive and to keep saying their names. I mean, once we forget or allow ourselves to collectively forget, this is when, you know, we add another name to the list, right? So we honor them by continuing to highlight them and not let them die in our memory.
Ian, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, Desmond, I don't know. Yeah, I wish I could have something a bit more hopeful to offer right now. But I honestly, I don't know.
That's okay. That's a real reaction that I think a lot of us can relate to. Robin, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, I think that anytime I need words to ground myself in what it means to be responsible to those who have been stolen from us, to those so many lives that have been senselessly lost, senselessly destroyed by state violence in this country, around the world. I need to ground myself, I think, in the words, again, of other generations of freedom fighters, again, as I think I've said so many different times, in so many different ways today, that continuity of struggle was something that grounds me, at least. So I'm paraphrasing loosely the words of Assata Shakur, who says, it is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and respect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And that's, to me, something that really captures the essence of duty in this moment, and this duty that we always have, not only to the dead, but of those for whom we would like to keep alive, going forward to those who are still with us, so that we can keep them with us.
Cyrus, finally.
I think that we remember them and hold on to, we say their names, we make sure that their names shape in our mouths and are familiar in our mouths, and then we fight like hell to make sure that there's not one more person taken from us, that this doesn't happen again. I think of our ancestors who had their children taken from them, who were brutalized on slave labor camps. I'm from the South. I think about, all of those moments where they would be, praying and hoping that their children or that their great-grandchildren would get to be born free. Well, we haven't quite completed that process of emancipation, and I'm going to fight like hell to make sure that we do. And I think that that's one of the strongest ways that I can think of to honor all of the generations of people who we've lost, is to fight like hell to make sure that not another Black life is taken, that not another person is killed by the police. And part of how we do that is by really reconsidering our police and prison system in North America.
Well, the fight continues. The struggle continues. We have to leave it there for this evening. Cyrus Marcus Ware, Robin Maynard, Ian Williams, and Essie Adujan, thank you so much for everything that you've shared this evening and that you continue to share with this country on an ongoing basis. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Desmond.
To all of you who have been tuning in this evening or who will watch later on, we thank you very much. Thank you to all of the Black people who are keeping up that fight across this country, to Indigenous peoples who preserved these territories for thousands of years before we were here. Thank you to all those who are interested and engaged in this moment. I hope that this conversation has given you a little bit to reflect and to chew on. Thank you so much. Thanks to Maclean's. Thanks again to Paul Wells and Andre Denise. Thank you to Irene Giannone, who's working behind the scenes to make you see what you're seeing right now. Thanks for watching, and good evening.